Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines is an amazing game. It doesn't amaze with its visuals or its gameplay, nor does it pioneer unique ideas or game mechanics. Vampire Bloodlines wasn't even the best game that came out in 2004, which, to be entirely fair, was a very strong year for new releases. In fact, Bloodlines was a commercial failure, and the story of its development and release was a tragic one. And yet, Bloodlines is a game that is fantastic when you dive into it wholesale. If I were to conjure up a visual simulation of what it means to experience Vampire the Masquerade without character sheets or tabletop miniatures, it would probably look a hell of a lot like Bloodlines. I previously mentioned in my Vampire the Masquerade Redemption video that Vampire Bloodlines is, if not my favorite video game of all time, certainly one of my all-time favorites. Part of it has to do with how well it nails that feeling and setting of Vampire the Masquerade, emphasizing the social aspects of the game and closely adhering to the tabletop game as a template when designing this as a solo adventure. But the other part is just how well put together it is as a game and just how fun it is to play. Sure, it plays fast and loose with some of the mechanics, which is necessary when adapting a franchise from one medium to another for the sake of preservation and functionality, but it did so elegantly. And it tries to tie everything together with a series of stories and plot elements and characters that are so gripping and so well written that it's hard not to appreciate what it accomplishes. It delivers a fantastic role-playing experience wherein the game mechanics are informed by character attributes, wherein the mood and atmosphere are palpable throughout the entirety of its campaign, and wherein player decisions make a tangible impact on how the game develops. But despite it being a genuinely good game, Bloodlines was ultimately the final nail in the coffin of its struggling development studio, Troika Games, who closed their doors soon after the game's release. Bloodlines was only their third game, and it was also the first game not being produced in-house at Valve to use the Source engine. However, what followed was a turbulent development cycle from the get-go. Early work with the Source engine was tumultuous, as the studio was working with unfamiliar code and tools, so they were forced to write a lot of their own code to compensate for the fact that the Source engine was, at the time, unfinished, and that they only had a single source for any technical support they needed. As time went on and work on the game was progressing slowly, the team soon found themselves hopelessly over budget. The game's scope was quickly exceeding their financial and technical resources. Extra features, such as the previously announced multiplayer mode, were entirely scrapped. After 3 years of development, a number of missed production milestones, and a plethora of technical issues, the game's publisher, Activision, had had enough. They issued an ultimatum that forced the project to be completed within a few months. Troika delivered a finished version of the game to Activision on September 15, 2004, but due to its scale, the game underwent 3 weeks of testing. Despite Activision's belief that the game was suitable for release, Troika wanted to take advantage of the fact that the game was contractually obligated to be withheld until after the debut of Half-Life 2, and so they convinced Activision to use the delay to further fund development. However, the additional budget that was allocated wasn't enough to pay all of Troika's staff, so some workers actually worked unpaid to complete the project. 3 more weeks of testing resulted in what would become the game's final release code. Despite all of that testing, however, the game's final release was still extremely buggy on launch. It was released to a mixed response from critics, with outlets praising its writing and presentation, but heavily criticizing its technical issues. It was also a commercial flop, selling only 72,000 copies and earning approximately $3.4 million in sales, Troika's poorest selling title in its library. For a long time, Bloodlines was a hidden gem. But these days it's a gem that isn't quite so hidden anymore. It's gained a cult following, and its popularity has only grown, due in no small part to a highly active community that has offered nearly 15 years of post-release support. It's difficult to enter into a discussion about Bloodlines and not hear someone sing its praises, as is continuously being recommended online. There are a lot of places where the game falls short, both on a technical level and in its inherent design, but Bloodlines is nevertheless a shining example of computer role-playing excellence, and it manages to overcome its flaws due to the sheer number of things it just does right. Visually, the presentation of Bloodlines is fantastic. The graphics may be dated, but the archaic fidelity is compensated by its captivating art style, complete with bright colors and character design that ranges from sensual to monstrous and everything in between. Every environment in the game is carefully constructed such that they each contribute a piece to the larger puzzle that is the World of Darkness. Even the one-off locations boast some of the most interesting and evocative story elements that the game has to offer, translating to truly memorable romps that take the player through museums, into warehouses, under sewers, in catacombs, and through lavish mansions. One particular place that stands out is the Ocean House Hotel, which, if you've played the game before, you're probably remembering right now with vivid clarity. Another is an especially gripping and intense sequence towards the end of the game in Griffith Park. It's a frantic race against the clock that does a masterful job of building tension and anxiety. These sequences are memorable precisely because of how well conceived and well executed they are. The game's setting takes place in what's known in the lore as the Final Nights, a time in which vampires all face what has been prophesied by some as the end times of their entire kind. If you're a fan of the tabletop game, then you might be aware that this is a literal event as well, since White Wolf ceased production of Vampire the Masquerade as a game line in the same year as Bloodlines' release. This underlying premise of the world as you know it on the brink of destruction manifests itself at the very core of Bloodlines' theme and mood, with a somber sense of imposing dread trailing after the player as they explore the game's world. It's a feeling that is omnipresent in all of the game's settings, as illustrated in the seedy decay of Santa Monica, the harrowing and genuinely creepy series of events that takes place in the Ocean House Hotel, to the malaise that lingers over the streets of Los Angeles, and even in the dark ambience of the nightclubs, wherein the denizens give themselves over to the primal electronic beats of gothic punk soundscapes. And to that point, this is an aspect that Bloodlines nails right on the head. The city's locations feel like they're a world that's lived in, with pedestrians of all ilk roaming the streets and going about their business. NPCs go to clubs, they have smoke breaks, they vandalize buildings by drawing graffiti, they relieve themselves in alleyways, and they even engage in illicit rendezvous with the various ladies of the night that are present in all 4 of the game's main hubs. Sometimes you'll even leave a building and witness a mugging in progress. Police will chase after you if you commit criminal violations, which mostly takes the form of a witnessed assault, and the game will even spawn vampire hunters to track you down and kill you for being the monster that you are if you reveal your vampiric nature too many times. While these hubs seem relatively empty given the technical limitations of the game, the very inclusion of those NPCs, along with those animations of them actually doing things aside from just standing around or walking around or waiting for the player to drain them of their blood points, is what really makes the game feel so alive. And none of these locations feel as if they've been copy-pasted from other places in the game either, which only further shows the development team's ability to create such unique locales that don't feel as if they're mere filler, with the exception of a few areas towards the end of the game that certainly feel as if they're a bit more rushed. And this is true of the game's plot as well. While the overall story of the game is great and it is strengthened by some truly wonderful writing during the first 2/3 of it, it is, at its very core, a MacGuffin-driven linear progression. That's not to say that's necessarily a bad thing, but the game does have a tendency to wrap its main quest objectives around scavenger hunts. However, they are scavenger hunts that allow you to interact with a wonderful cast of characters, all of whom are tremendously written and have their own personalities and motivations. Every single NPC you encounter in the game has some level of depth to them, and while not all of them are truly three-dimensional, the vast majority of the important ones are. Even minor characters have their own memorable quirks and personalities.
Player, what's the score? How they hang? Good evening and all that commotion. Welcome to Fat Larry's Trucker Mac, the only store for all your needs after 10 o'clock. I am the proprietor and salesman of the month several years in a row. The ladies call me, oh God, but you can call me Fat Larry with a F-A-T, cause I know I got a weight problem, I just don't give a fuck.
And that extra level of detail represented through competent writing and some fantastic voice acting really makes the game's setting pop. After creating a character, which is limited to one of the 7 clans within the Camarilla, the introduction shows a chain of events in which the player becomes a dread creature of the night, including a stay of execution from the Prince of Los Angeles in a political maneuver that puts the player character in his debt. The opening segment leads into a tutorial, teaching the player the ins and outs of the life of a vampire, and it does a very good job of easing them into picking up the game's mechanics. From there, the player progresses through a series of story quests that are fairly simple and straightforward. However, what makes this game truly special is the window dressing. The story is presented in such a way that even if the core game is a rudimentary fetch quest or progression to a boss fight, there's enough context and motivation given that these sorts of thoughts become second nature. Every time an NPC is sent me to retrieve something for them, it's never felt as if it was a chore, because every quest was another foray into a new area with new things to see and experience. Furthermore, there's rarely only a single way to complete an objective for a quest. Staying true to their roots in designing other RPGs such as Fallout and Arcanum of Steamworks and Magic Obscura, Troika designed many of Bloodlines' combat areas to give you the option of employing stealth or combat at your leisure, whichever you prefer. And even if an NPC tells you not to kill anybody, you're not held to that standard, and the game will adjust itself to accommodate for your decision in that regard.
What did I tell you? It's all over the police radio! Do you comprehend the consequences of your actions? This kind of exposure reeks of the supernatural in mortal eyes. Even the Sabbat aren't this careless.
Certain rewards may even be lost due to player behavior, such as a secondary base of operations in downtown Los Angeles, or even extra experience points for completing missions without shedding any blood. This mentality also applies to objectives that don't turn into combat situations. You always have the option to smooth talk information out of someone, whether it's through persuasion, intimidation, or seduction, or for some vampires who have evolved their powers enough, through certain use of their disciplines. But if those methods don't suit you, or if you didn't create a socially oriented character, you can also find the relevant intel on hackable PCs or stashed away behind locked doors. There are a plethora of options available for players, many of which are impossible to see on a single playthrough, particularly as this is one of those RPGs that doesn't allow you to maximize all of your abilities by the end of the game. There will be gaps in what you can do, which does become apparent when it comes to gameplay. Bloodlines is a true RPG, and it has game mechanics that reflect player ability. Firing a gun always has a chance to miss, even if the reticle is directly on a target because you're essentially rolling dice in order to make a hit. Some people may find that off-putting, but for someone like myself, that's what makes this game a real RPG, and I love it for it. Character builds determine what you can do and what you can't do, what you're good at and what you're not good at, which in turn has an effect on how you interact with the game's story. But despite the relative linearity of the main plot, there are plenty of side quests to distract the player and encourage them to further explore the dark corners of the world of darkness. And much like the game's main quests, there are usually multiple ways to approach these problems as well, depending on the strength of your character. Because of Vampire the Masquerade's roots as a social game, however, many of these quests involve choosing sides and actively supporting one character's agenda versus another's. For example, one quest revolves around a particular Camarilla vampire that the player may encounter. He requests the player's discretion with dealing with a problem that can potentially put him in a very awkward situation. After dealing with the issue, either through diplomacy or the old-fashioned way, the problem then arises of whether or not the player will hold their tongue about the whole thing. Of course, you're free to do so if you want, but you're also allowed to leak the information to a rival party as well, which will strengthen your relationship with the latter at the expense of the former. In this particular playthrough, I did just that, and what resulted was that he literally locked me out of his house and didn't want to talk to me anymore. And while this may seem like a meaningless, isolated decision, it actually has the potential to offer a lasting effect on the game, including the ability to bar the player from achieving one of the 5 endings that the game offers. This is the sort of player agency that should be strived for when playing a role-playing game, as it makes the player feel like there are consequences for every action that they take. Who do you befriend? Who do you trust? Who do you think really has your best interests at heart? The answer to those questions may or may not surprise you as you unravel the layers of the conspiracy that surrounds you. That sense of reactivity isn't limited to quest branches either. There are many instances of your decisions resonating throughout the campaign. Even something as minor as a dialogue option can have far-reaching effects on gameplay and story. For instance, treating one of the early NPCs you meet in the game with contempt will result in him lashing out at you, forcing you to kill him.
While you were gone, I did a bit of thinking. See, I don't want to risk some loudmouth smart-ass upstart going and making me look bad. So in a few minutes, I'm gonna break the news to LaCroix that kid he sent never made it out alive.
Hey, where you going, man?
If that happens, you effectively lose the means to acquire some of the most powerful firearms in the game. Or if you act uppity and disobedient towards Prince LaCroix, you will lose access to that quite convenient haven in downtown Los Angeles. And if you're playing a female character and you get past Officer Chunk in Santa Monica via seduction, well, be prepared to be continually hit on him for the rest of the game.
Snack cake? What are you doing here? I mean, I gotta admit, I'm a little flattered if you're stalking me, but anyhow, you see where your little security muffins ended up? Night shift lobby sergeant, huh? Hey, stick with me, because I'm going straight to the top, baby.
There are other smaller examples too. If you're playing a Malkavian and you choose to turn Heather Poe into a ghoul by feeding her some of your blood, you effectively pass on some of your vampiric weakness to her, and her dialogue later on will become erratic and strange, which reflects the effect that your character is having on her.
I went fishing today, and I caught a big one. Can you hear him flopping around the bathroom? That's how you can tell he's fresh.
So, have you done any other kinds of writing?
What the hell is this shit? Let me out, goddammit! I'll kill that crazy bitch!
For context, here's that same conversation, but with a non-Malkavian character.
Oh, you're back. I went out this evening and I met someone and he wouldn't leave me alone, so he came back here with me and, well, I thought you might want to drink his blood. In the bathroom. I locked him in. Did I mess up?
Or if you have a low enough humanity level when discussing your actions on the Elizabeth Dane with LaCroix, you have the option to refer to the bloodshed as majestic, which reflects your bestial and monstrous nature. All of these are just a few demonstrations of how the game reacts to player expression. The game does have consequences for your actions, particularly those that defy the in-game legality of the world you find yourself in. But it also doesn't try to limit you or guide you towards what it thinks the correct action should be. You're free to act as you will, and the game will respond to the choices you make, for good or for ill. And the game's mechanics also carry the theme of agency, as, even there, the design philosophy of balancing choice and consequence is present. Take for instance the means by which a player character replenishes their blood pool through hunting. It isn't uncommon to sneak up on an unsuspecting victim enjoying a cigarette to quench your thirst, or to do your same to the lonely homeless person hiding under the roof of a pawn shop. If that sounds like it's too much work, the only obstacle stopping the player from hiring a prostitute to achieve the same ends are their finances, or their heritage if they happen to be Nosferatu. And if that doesn't suit your taste, there's always the rats crawling around in the sewers that can be drained for a single blood point. To that end, the game enforces what the tabletop refers to as the Masquerade portion of Vampire the Masquerade. Simply put, vampires can't let humans know that vampires exist amongst their midst. Therefore, one must be very careful as to not let anyone see them feeding on that poor sod on the street. There are consequences for throwing away any semblance of subtlety as far as upholding the Masquerade is concerned. Too many violations and the player's game ends by the hand of those pulling the strings around them. How does one violate the Masquerade? Well, by acting like a vampire in public, and tipping off the world at large that these creatures exist among us. Here's the caveat though. Every single vampire, unless you're Sabat, struggles to contain that inner beast and play the part of a normal human. If that inner beast is stirred by, say, anger or hunger, then the vampire enters a frenzied rage, in which they give themselves over to their baser instincts. Now, in game terms, it means the player loses control of their character and watches them forsake any actions that they may have. What you end up doing is watching your character go on a bloody rampage and attack anything on sight, or if you're hungry, drain the nearest vessel of their blood in order to save off that beast. Of course, this can be avoided by maintaining a high enough level of humanity. The higher the level of your humanity, the less likely it is that you're going to frenzy. And it's possible to have an entire playthrough where you do not frenzy even once. In fact, the game encourages that. It's mentioned in the opening tutorial that you're not meant to kill the people that you're feeding from. Always make sure you leave at least a little bit of blood in their system. Never let that bar fully drain. But of course, accidents do happen. There are a few ways to regain humanity as the game goes on. Spending some time on the dance floor of a club lets you regain 1 point of humanity per hub, and some quests give you humanity as rewards based on your actions. You can also buy humanity dots just like you can with any other ability, but I don't recommend this course of action because there's plenty of ways for you to regain it as the game goes on. In this way, Bloodlines manages to strike a fine balance between regulating the subtleties of keeping one's true identity hidden and the necessity of resource management by giving the player a tangible penalty for ignoring either of those things. This is especially key when one considers that blood is the chief means of powering your vampiric powers, and that over-reliance on your disciplines will cause prolonged periods of hunger, which increases the risk of frenzy, which potentially leads the player closer to their own execution through Masquerade violations. It's a wonderful system of cause and effect that forces the player to truly put themselves in this role of playing a vampire in this dark world that they entered against their own volition, which again reinforces the key themes of the game's plot. And the game really as a whole does capture that feeling of playing a vampire through its gameplay, and not just enables you to play a character that happens to be a vampire, and that's a key difference. A lot of that is reflected in those aforementioned mechanics, but also in the differences between the vampire clans. Bloodlines goes above and beyond to reflect on those idiosyncrasies of each playable clan and the different factions that you encounter. Take for example that aforementioned Nosferatu. A Nosferatu is, as the name implies, a vampire that looks like Count Orlok from the movie Nosferatu. That mere act of walking around in public is enough to evoke a breach, which forces you to wander around in the sewers, a punishment that isn't present for any of the other clans. Now, this doesn't prevent you from doing most of the same things as the other clans. However, you do see a number of NPC reactions that none of the other clans will see based on the sheer fact that these people are talking to a hideously deformed monster.
Yeah, what'll it be? Lord! Oh, sweet Jesus!
But no clan has such a unique experience to the game as do the Malkavians. Their clan's inherent weakness is that each and every last member of this clan are stark raving mad. But, due to their madness, they often have an insight into things that other clans don't. And this is reflected by some of the obscure dialogue lines that make subtle references to things that aren't immediately apparent, all written in this kooky looking font to reflect on the protagonist's madness.
You mean Santa Monica? You sure got a strange way of saying things.
And if Troika's willingness to rewrite the entire game script just to drive this point home isn't impressive enough, on top of fashioning different responses for male and female characters, then maybe their random encounters with rival stop signs is. Or their discussions with TV news anchors that allegorically comment on the character's particular situation.
Did you hear the one about the tuna and the chef? A tuna walks into a sushi restaurant, says to the chef, "Hey, you killed my father." Chef says to the tuna, "That's my business, fish." Tuna thinks about it, says, "Then I challenge you to a game of chess. If I win, you stop being a chef forever. And if I win," asks the chef, "you can feed me to your customers." Tuna replies. So the chef and Tuna play chess. Tunas love to play chess, so in a few moves, the chef was checkmated. "Well, looks like I win," says the tuna. Chef nods and plunges his knife into the fish's belly. "But I won," says the tuna, as he feels the knife wiggling into his guts. "So did your father," says the chef.
Or maybe the whispers that they occasionally hear in their heads that comment on the various happenings in the game.
I guess.
Even the Malkavian signature discipline, Dementation, pushes this immersive feeling home, as it opens up many moments where you can sow chaos by inflicting NPCs with bouts of madness to get out of tricky situations.
Let me make a call. We'll get everybody together and we can talk. Maybe you'll remember something. The important thing is that they know that you're alive. Shelly? Holy crap, you got big! I'm sorry I flushed you. I thought you were dead. So, what's it like to be a turtle?
Confession, bitch, send you. Money. Where is money? No money? Salmon? Must eat salmon.
It's similar to the Ventrus Dominate, but with much more humorous effects. Mechanically, the two don't differ very much at all, but it's that extra flavor that's added that really makes the game feel so immersive. This doesn't mean, however, that the game is flawless. Despite the satisfaction that the final sequences may bring as the story wraps up, there's clearly a disconnect between the first two acts and the third one. The further one progresses through the game, the more quickly they begin to see the thread unravel. Character dialogue begins to lose its wit. Levels begin to offer fewer means to complete them, and they often resort to violence. The luster of the mystery begins to fade, and at this point one can see where the development team began to feel the pressure of crunch time to push the product out the door. For a game that's emphasized player choice and agency as a means of dealing with the situations presented from the beginning, this can come as a rather surprising blow. Players who use their experience dots to flesh out their stealth skill at the expense of their melee skill will certainly be at a disadvantage, but not necessarily a crippling one, save for perhaps one of the several boss fights at the end that they may or may not face depending on their actions throughout the course of the campaign. Those final areas of the game turn into slogs, and it's mentally taxing. The game strings together 3 major areas where the only option to progress is to fight, and what begins as a wonderfully paced role-playing game filled with intrigue and great writing turns into a continuous romp of mouse clicking and save game reloading. And when one considers how unpolished the combat feels, that can be really problematic. The gunplay is decent enough, but recall that you're using stats to see if you can hit an opponent, which means that it's not relying on your real-world accuracy, but rather using dice rolls to see if you can hit and damage your opponent. The game boasts a decent number of firearms, mostly comprising of various pistols and shotguns, but it also has a number of other, more exotic weapons, like flamethrowers. All in all, you won't be lacking for guns, and in fact, it's all too easy to become a walking arsenal with enough firepower to pretty much deal with any threat thrown your way. The only other complaint I have about guns are the sound assets for the game are really weak. However, this is very easily fixed through modding. Melee combat, on the other hand, feels very janky at times, as the animations become the player's biggest hindrance. Movements aren't very smooth at all, and attacks leave the player open to vulnerabilities with lavish flourishes added to the third attack of a successive combo. However, with no real means of dodging or parrying, melee combat becomes an exercise in clicking your mouse as quickly as you can, especially when faced with multiple opponents and ones that are more resistant to firearms at that. You can block incoming attacks by pressing tab, but I found that this particular tactic to be nearly useless. I have a hunch that doing so actually increases your chance to succeed a behind-the-scenes dice roll to avoid incoming damage, as increasing your defense feat does lead to more instances of actually succeeding at this, but if that's the case, then it's very poorly communicated by the game. I still feel that you're much better off just spamming an attack combo and hoping to outmuscle your enemy, which more often than not works just as well. Other mechanics like lockpicking and sneaking are handled decently enough, relying on action keys to take care of them, and there's no minigames to speak of whatsoever. Whether or not this is a problem is really up to the subjective whims of the player. They serve the needs of the game just fine, and at no point was I demanding more from this department. However, there is a noticeable discrepancy between useful skills and useless ones. Some skills barely come into play and are just really stat dumps. Putting dots into finance increases the haggle feat, which influences the prices of items when buying or selling them from vendors, or lets you purchase warm blood at a lower rate. The thing is that these price changes are negligible, and you have access to so much cash and ammo pickups throughout the game that I never felt once that I was ever strapped for cash. Investigation is another similar feat. It highlights objects in the game with glowing dots that signify things that your character has spotted, usually in the form of items that you can pick up to sell to vendors, but also in the form of books, weapons, and key items. However, you can still find these items with enough searching on your own, making it only situationally helpful as a means of directing your attention to something that isn't particularly critical to the game. And of course, Bloodlines also has its fair share of bugs and glitches. It was never a truly polished game to begin with, but there are still a lot of holdovers using an old engine with some shoddy implementation. Getting stuck in doorways because you tried to walk through before the door fully opened is commonplace. So too is the AI getting stuck in places in a similar manner. Also, it's not uncommon to see game objects floating around in the air after they've been discarded. The game also has some really bad audio layering as well, with high volumes not being adjusted to compensate for the initiation of dialogue.
The moon is out, everyone's in dreamland, and you've tuned into the dead of night. Nobody
Welcome to Red
asleep
Spot,
next to you?
home of the Monster
Go ahead
Chug.
and pull the
72
radio
ounces
into
of your
bed.
favorite
That's what I'm
beverage
here
for 89
for.
cents. Blah, blah.
And hey,
Not to mention how awful the environmental effects can sound. I can see what the devs were trying to do when they implemented this option, but it just doesn't sound particularly great at all.
Your sire. Tragic. My apologies. But you see, there is a strict code of conduct that all of us must adhere to if we wish to survive. When anyone breaks these laws, they undermine the well-worn fabric of our centuries-old society. Understand my predicament.
My recommendation is to turn that off when you play the game. Bloodlines also has issues with water textures, wherein they will occasionally break and begin to reflect many of the other area textures, and it creates this weird doubling effect that's a little hard to describe. Needless to say, it's very annoying to see, and quite frankly, pretty disorienting. All of these are issues that are still present in the game even after I've applied an unofficial patch to fix it. Which means that if you do intend to play Bloodlines, be aware that the sewer areas and the Nosferatu Warrens will glitch out on you, and as far as I know, there's no real fix to this. There are a few other things too, like the game's script getting broken at times and not despawning NPCs after quests have been completed, or how occasionally dropping key items will cause quests to reappear as journal entries despite finishing them and permanently closing off the areas where they occur. Though I will say that these are issues that have only ever occurred using the unofficial basic patch, and I have never encountered them while playing the game using unofficial patch plus, so your mileage may vary. And since I'm on the subject of the unofficial patch, now is as good a time as any to talk about the modding scene for this game. Bloodlines was incredibly buggy when it was first released. However, the game has been kept alive by a number of fan updates. The most notable of these is the unofficial patch, a fan effort that began in 2004 and has been taken over by Wesp5, who still updates it regularly. The patch itself comes in two varieties. The basic patch fixes many of the game's bugs and doesn't include any new content to the game. It keeps the experience as vanilla as possible. The plus patch, on the other hand, is a result of years of additions being made to the game over time. It changes some of the stuff around, restores some cut content, and adds some new content that could be argued that doesn't really uphold the creator's original vision. It treads closer to mod territory, which is why there are two versions of the patch. That being said, the plus patch has its own issues, like West 5's inability to fix an exploit that's caused by spending dots on the character creation screen and then swapping out that character's history, which gives you a fresh pool of spendable dots. It basically allows you to cheat to create a much more powerful character from the game's get-go. But if you do that, this happens.
I'd be pissed if this wasn't so cute. Look at you trying so hard. It's absolutely precious. Yeah, whenever you're done, sweet cheeks, we can move this show along.
I love that the patch creator figured that if he can't stop people from exploiting the game, at least he can tell you how he feels about it. This mod is still being worked on to this day, and new releases are constantly being rolled out. If you get the game on GOG, it comes pre-bundled with the most current stable version of UP Basic, which makes the game very playable out of the box. If you want all that extra content, however, all you need to do is install the UP Plus patch over top of your existing installation. Whichever version you choose, the unofficial patch is a must for the game. There's also True Patch Gold, which is intended to be a response to the unofficial patch and present Bloodlines in the most ultimate vanilla way possible. However, it's a very old program that, as far as I know, hasn't been updated in a very long time, and the last time I tried to use it, it didn't work on my Windows 10 machine. I highly recommend you use unofficial patch in its stead. Bloodlines modding also ranges from smaller mods like NPC model skins and improved audio assets to complete game overhauls. Pretty much all of these overhauls incorporate that unofficial patch in their framework, but are rarely updated to constantly work with the latest version, so a lot of them use older versions. A lot of these are very good, but they tend to have an equal amount of fans and detractors. But there's one overhaul that I swear by, and that is the Clan Quest mod. The Clan Quest mod began as a project that incorporated extra quests into the game that were exclusive for each of the game's playable clans. Over time, however, It's grown to the point where it may as well be considered an expansion pack for the game, as it not only includes some of those other more popular mods out there as optional files to be installed, but it also offers so much content that it actually adds hours of playtime to the game. The latest version of ClanQuest mod even adds an entire new hub area and the ability to join the Sabbat in an alternate path for the endgame. Not only that, but the amount of polish put into it is spectacular. Every single new NPC has voice lines recorded by semi-professional voice actors, and the extra content fits seamlessly into the game. If you're a stickler for lore, you'll find that much of the new content is very loyal to the source material, even going so far as to adding quests that further your understanding of the World of Darkness beyond the scope of what Bloodlines originally offered. This is one overhaul that I advocate for even on a first-time playthrough. While I understand why people say you should experience the game as close to the original form as possible, I honest to goodness truly feel that if you are only going to play Bloodlines once, you're doing yourself an incredible disservice by not playing with the ClanQuest mod. It is seriously that good. I've added the links to the ClanQuest mod, the unofficial patch, True Patch Gold, and the audio overhaul I use all in the description below if you're interested in checking them out. So, despite its flaws, Bloodlines is a shining example of the whole overshadowing the sum of its parts. Even with a rushed third act and a plethora of issues, it's a game that doesn't feel bogged down by the weight of those flaws, and its roughly 25 to 30 hour completion time feels just right for the story that the game tells. Its pacing is on point, and at no point does it ever overstay its welcome. Not only that, but it just feels really good to play. Even if you're not a fan of World of Darkness or Vampire the Masquerade, it does such a good job of bringing that world to life and enticing your imagination that I would easily recommend this as an introduction to the tabletop game. For all the content that's packed into it, I don't think $20 is asking for too much. It's a bit steep considering that it's an older game, but given as to the quality of the final product and the replayability of it, with or without the modding scene, it's not an entirely unreasonable ask. But if that's not enough to convince you, it does regularly go on sale for around $5 or $6. I would urge anybody who is a fan of CRPGs to pick this game up. If you're a fan of Vampire the Masquerade, chances are that you've probably already played this game and just like hearing how great it is, which I'm happy to gush about. If you have even the slightest interest in Vampire the Masquerade, especially pre-5th edition, then you should definitely play this game. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines is one of those games that die-hard fans will reinstall every year or two and go through again and again, simply because it has so much to offer. Or if you're like me, it's one of the first games you install on a new computer and you never remove again. It's a wonderful experience that few other games can duplicate, offering a rich affair and a lush world, and making the player really feel like they're playing a role rather than going through a cinematic romp with inventory management. If any game deserves a second chance at being experienced by a new generation of fans, it's this one. Just hold off on playing a Malkavian or a Nosferatu for your second or third time around. It'll make for a much more interesting experience that way.